Today we're talking about a very important topic that I hold very close to my heart. We're talking about fatherhood because it's Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to all you dedicated fathers out there, all you strong masculine men, all you toxic males, all you wonderful patriarchs. Where would we be without great father figures in our lives? And so we're talking about some of the musical fathers in the music business, in the R&B world, in the pop world. So the first big, famous, legendary musical father that I was doing some research on today is Mr. Bob Marley. And Bob Marley, of course, the reggae slash folk rock superstar, he influenced an entire generation, an entire genre of music, right? But he also had an extremely powerful and positive influence on his children, namely his three kids. We're talking about Ziggy Marley, we're talking about Stephen Marley, and we're talking about Damian Marley. One of those names doesn't quite fit with the rest, but whatever. So first off, we have Ziggy. Now, Ziggy was obviously raised in a very musical family, and looks like I got a thingy popping up there. So Ziggy, raised in a musical family, and now if you have any reservations in your mind, if you have any doubts about some of the benefits of raising your kids and teaching them music, giving them music lessons, teaching them music, making them listen to music, making them study music at a young age. Ziggy Marley, of course, went on to win 7 Grammys. He has put out 6 albums. Now, let's keep going, okay? You could say, okay, well, maybe Ziggy was just lucky. Maybe he just hit the 1 in a million. He hit the jackpot. He's cut from a different cloth. Well, we have Stephen Marley, who went on to win 6 Grammys. And of course, Damon Marley is extremely versatile musician and has been putting records out and doing a lot of recording, live performance, and all that. So, but just to win a Grammy is no small feat, folks. Much less 6, 7 Grammys. So that is our first big musical father right there. You've got Bob Marley bringing up his kids, and they go on to win Grammys, which may not happen if it's anyone else besides Bob Marley as your father. But I digress. We're going to keep moving here to positive role model father number 2. And this father you might recognize. He's a little known rock and roll artist by the name of Sir Paul McCartney. And of course, if you're not familiar, which why wouldn't you be, but Sir Paul McCartney, one of the 4 horsemen of the Beatles, probably the most, I would say probably the most predominant, the most well-known. I would consider McCartney to be kind of the face of the Beatles. I'm more of a John Lennon guy personally, but I'm a weirdo, so. But anyway, little side question for y'all Beatles fans out there. Who is your favorite Beatle? And do you have any juicy tidbits, any interesting information about how the other Beatles have dealt with fatherhood, with raising kids, with balancing the work, music, life, touring type of lifestyle? I know a lot of the guys that follow me on my page are like super duper connected dudes, and they like Mr. Eugene Chapman. This guy just knows stuff about musicians that nobody else would know, probably because he was hanging out with them and they just like told him some secret in the back alley somewhere. So Mr. Paul McCartney, generally considered to be a decent father, I would say. And so he has a son, and Mr. McCartney's son is named James McCartney. And this is his only son now. So what I found interesting when I was reading about Mr. James McCartney, is when he was growing up, when he was younger and he was working as a waiter and bussing tables and checking out cashier, doing the cashier thing and taking money and giving people pennies and working for tips, which, let's face it, he never had to do any of those. He never had to do any of that stuff. So I think it's kind of cool, like, before we even get to the really interesting part, but I think it's kind of cool that we have Paul McCartney's only son, is the heir to his empire, to his fortune, to the entire Beatles catalog. Um, and here it is, waiting tables like some anonymous nobody, right? So it's kind of interesting. I found that kind of cool. But the really interesting part for me is the fact that James McCartney actually made a very strong effort to try and hide his last name. He didn't want anybody to know that he was a McCartney, because people will say probably, "Oh, you're Paul McCartney's son, so you probably were just born with a silver spoon in your mouth, and you probably just don't have any real world experience," and blah 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 blah. So I thought that was kind of cool. He's like almost ashamed of the superstardom of his father because he doesn't want to be judged by people who are just normal, everyday people like you or I. So I thought that was kind of cool. I think eventually, I read something about how he used a pseudonym. He did some writing and actually had a like fake name. He called himself Light for a little while for as a pseudonym for a few of his creative works that he was doing. But of course, James McCartney also appeared on Paul's solo albums, his father. And so that's kind of cool because you have the son, you don't know if they're going to really have any kind of talent or all whatsoever. But he's, kind of propping him up and putting him in the studio and giving them that experience, probably at a fairly young age. If you have more information about any of this stuff, by the way, feel free to comment it in the comment section down below. So there's the first few positive musical fathers. And actually, this one is not in my script, but I'm going to add this one because this is one that I've actually studied and spent a lot of time with. And that's Mr. Frank Zappa. Now, Frank Zappa was a great father in the sense that none of his kids ever ended up in jail as they were living in his house. He had a few children with a few really strange names. Now, you can debate all you want about the process of naming your child something like Dweezil or something like Moon Unit or Ahmet. Trying to remember his last child's name. Dweezil, Moon Unit, Ahmet. I can't remember the last one for the life of me. Leave me a comment if you know the fourth weird name of Zappa's children. And when it came out that he was naming his children this, Zappa actually got a huge PR boost around this time because everybody was like, "Oh, Frank Zappa, he's such a weirdo. What a bad guy. What a terrible person for naming his children all this terrible stuff. Oh, they're going to go through life. They're going to be bullied." Well, guess what? A few of his children they didn't like having the weird name, as you might imagine, especially when they get into their teen years. But the one son that he did have that went on to do great things in the music business, Dweezil Zappa, it's widely known that he actually loved this name and he was offered the chance to change it and didn't want to. He wanted to keep it. He identified around this crazy name. And as a result, I mean, well, we know about Moon Unit for some of her commercial things that she did in the 80s, but really the one child that had a lot of staying power of Zappa's is Mr. Dweezil. And he went on to follow in his father's footsteps. He did Zappa Plays Zappa. He played all his father's insanely difficult music and put new lineups and new band members. And all of this, Zappa would bring Dweezil into the studio with guys like Steve Vai and amazing drummers, amazing keyboard players like Tommy Mars and etc. And so Dweezil got this kind of experience at a very young age, and therefore he was able to move on and carry that experience through. And he came into his own. He was like a little mini Zappa that went out into the world and did great things. And I think that most Zappa fans would absolutely agree that Dweezil carried on the family name, and he absolutely did it justice. It's not like he took Zappa's super technical jazz fusion and turned it into like pop punk. No, he did quite the opposite. He kept the same type of challenging subject matter and interesting material, difficult music that required a high level of musicianship. He was very passionate about rehearsing and putting on very well coordinated, well rehearsed live shows. So that is the story of Dweezil Zappa. And yeah, if Frank had not been there influencing him and modeling all of this great creativity and all of this great stuff, we would not know Dweezil, but many people would also have never heard of Frank. And so it's almost like it's in the father's best interest to really be involved with their child's life and really care about what they want to do. And he had another situation where one of his kids wanted to, I think it was Ahmet, wanted to change his name. He wanted to be called like Bob or something. and so they went along with it. They called him Bob for like a few years, and that's what they did. So, it wasn't like Frank was forcing this onto his kids. He was simply giving them a unique, different name that he thought was normal in his weird Frank Zappa-ish mind. And they didn't want to go along with it. They didn't have to. This was not like a iron fist ruling type of thing. Is it fatherhood in and of itself? Is it masculinity in and of itself that is the problem here? Or is it more complicated than that? Does it actually come down to something deeper, like maybe something that goes into how the father was raised? Does it come down to something that it's not just the fact that they were a man, but the fact that what they experienced in their life was something that led them down a certain path that had some bad consequences. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward here, because again, we do want to be nuanced. We do want to be fair about these stories. So the first guy here, the first gentleman that we're going to talk about, is a fine gentleman by the name of Joe Jackson, Mr. Joseph Jackson. Now, Joe Jackson, you might know, is the father of Michael Jackson and, of course, the Jackson 5. So he's widely known as being the architect of the Jackson 5. And to this day, the Jacksons and their siblings kind of consider Joe to be sort of responsible for a large part of their success. But it's not all a happy story with a totally happy ending here. So some of the things Joe Jackson would inflict on his children were stuff like incessant rehearsing. He would whip, he would beat, he would abuse his children physically. He would call them names. That I would consider, psychological abuse, mental abuse. So you had both sides of it. You had the physical, you have the mental. Generally not a very nice guy when it came to his kids, unfortunately. And, of course, Joe Jackson says he wouldn't really consider it beating because he didn't hit them with hard objects, and he didn't hit them randomly. So in other words, his young, defenseless children, well, they kind of deserved it. So does that really count as beating? And if you can't tell, I'm obviously being sarcastic here. I completely disagree with this assessment. I think any sort of violent physical abuse to children is wrong. It's flat out wrong. I work with kids as my main source of income. It's my main hustle. And never once has the thought crossed my mind to do anything physical to them at all whatsoever. And I have a pretty tough job because music, as a lot of you know, is very complex. There's a lot of theory, there's a lot of vocabulary, and you're getting young children in the age range of, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old to do very complicated, difficult tasks that they do not want to do. They hate it. They don't like it. It's not fun for them. It's not generally not fun until they get a little bit of the hang of it. Uh, then they start having fun because then you know the basics and you kind of do what you want. You can say, "Oh, I'd rather do a decrescendo instead of a crescendo there because that's how I feel." And I say, "You know what? That's great." But if you don't know what a crescendo is in the first place, makes it kind of tough to play with any kind of emotion. Um, so there's difficulties when you're trying to teach children stuff, and not once have I ever had the inclination to try and beat it into them with some sort of physical implement. It never comes up. And if I'm teaching very complicated music theory and vocabulary to these kids, I mean, how hard is it to get them to eat like their green beans or clean up their blocks when they're done playing with it? Like, really? Like, you're gonna beat them for leaving a hairbrush in the wrong room? As one of the Joe Jackson anecdotes I read, or leaving a folding a towel the wrong way, or doing this the wrong way. Like, is it really worth attacking your poor defenseless child? And in my opinion, I'm a very strong advocate for peaceful parenting, and that you shouldn't have to do that. And so obviously I disagree with Joe Jackson here. He's trying to rationalize it by saying it wasn't beating because it didn't meet this super hyperbolic specific definition of what I consider beating. So therefore it's okay. Guess what, Joe? It's not okay. Full stop. And if you disagree with me, definitely leave a comment in the comment section down below. We will go back and forth, and I will physically abuse you all with stats and facts and logic. So, yeah, it sounds like to me that Joe was actually punishing his children for his own mistakes. And what I mean is, if you have a kid that doesn't clean up their mess, doesn't do what they're supposed to do, well, where did they learn that behavior from, Joe? Maybe have you cleaned up every single mess just perfectly? Are you a perfect human being, Joe? Well, if not, then you're teaching, you're modeling that behavior to your kids. And when they just mimic it and model it back to you, newsflash, it's not really their fault. It is actually you teaching them a behavior and then punishing them for that behavior. So this is the long and short of my opinion on peaceful parenting and why I completely disagree with Joe Jackson's physical abuse of his children and physical abuse of children in general. So you might be thinking to yourself, "Oh, well, but my kids are so bad. How are we supposed to discipline them?" Well, it's exactly what I said, folks. This is not that complicated. If you model positive behavior, if you show them how to act correctly, they don't know anything else, right? So either you taught them that, or you are bringing some kind of stranger into the house and they're teaching it to them. You're plapping them into the daycares and they're learning it from some other person that you don't even know. So these are, I think, some of the things that go into the psychosis that tricks parents into believing that they're completely in the right for abusing their children. And you can literally see the rationalization going when you go to read some of the quotes that Joe Jackson says about his beating of his children. And yes, it was beating. So let's move on from that. Not the happiest topic to be talking about, but this is because we're talking about fatherhood here, and some fathers are a little more aggressive. Some of them are very strict, and I'm not really advocating for that. But I think rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, "Oh, all men are evil," I think we should kind of take the bad with the good a little bit here. And, the Jacksons consider, like, what did they say? Michael Jackson himself admitted that his father's strict discipline, it's a direct quote, his father's strict discipline played a large part in his success. So even though he went too far, right, by crossing over the cavern of, okay, now I'm just going to beat him, even though he did, in fact, go too far, everything up to that point, the strict discipline, the rehearsing, you know, you can't really knock the guy. You can't, don't hate the player, hate the game. I think if the music business in general was more open to new artists and new acts and unique original acts, maybe they wouldn't have had to push, or maybe he wouldn't have had to push his kids as hard. And it's the nature of the business, folks. If you want to be successful, you have to have that level of discipline. And the sad reality is it is not comfortable, it is not easy, it is not fun a lot of the time. But wouldn't you like to live in a house like Neverland Ranch? And so Michael Jackson himself says, hey, if it wasn't for my strict, evil, mean, patriarchal, what do you call him? Toxic male father, I wouldn't have the success I have today. And so I think that's interesting. I think in some way it might be a little bit of like rationalizing the abuse that happened to him, but hopefully Michael has overcome that and processed what was done to him, so that he didn't continue that cycle with his own children. And speaking of cycles, Joe Jackson was raised in the Deep South in the Great Depression, and he experienced the exact same type of discipline. We're talking about physical abuse. We're talking about strictness, harshness, the name calling. Again, where do you think Joe learned this stuff from? He just came out of the womb into the world just an evil guy, just a bad guy? I don't think so. I think this isn't excusing what he did, but it goes a far ways to explain where this type of mentality comes from. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. And, this kind of stuff was taught to him, just like he attempted to teach it to his children. And hopefully they overcame that. I haven't done a lot of reading into how the other siblings dealt with that. But I think Michael, with all his riches and successes, I think he might have been able to take the bad with the good. And that's what we're talking about today, by the way, if you're just joining us. Fatherhood, some of the negative sides of it, some of the positive sides of it. And yeah, how we can't just be talking trash about fathers. And we're going to find out why that is in a minute. But before we do that, we're going to talk about another terrible father, one of the worst that I could find preparing for this show. And this is, of course, Mr. Marvin Gay Sr. And so Marvin Gay Sr., obviously the father of Marvin Gay Jr., who is the R&B icon we all know and love, wrote tons of hit songs. So what did Marvin Gaye have to deal with when he was growing up? So because they have the same name, I'm going to try to figure out a way to talk about the father and the son here. I'm going to say Marvin Sr. for the father. We're going to say Marvin Jr. for the son. So there was physical abuse. Another thing that seems to be more common here with Marvin Gaye Sr. is extramarital affairs. He was married, he was remarried multiple times, and multiple children from multiple different wives. And you have to imagine how that's going to affect a young, growing Marvin Gaye Jr. When you got your father who doesn't even care enough about his own family to like stick by them and see them through school and see them through college and et cetera, et cetera. So he's out trying to find some sort of fulfillment by dissing his own family. And this is sadly um, a very common thing that musicians have to deal with, especially. Because musicians get a little taste of fame. It actually occurred in my family, a little further back. Not my parents, thank goodness, but a little bit further back into their lineage, they had to deal with this kind of stuff growing up, and uh, it's it's terrible. You have strangers. Your parents are bringing strangers around, and they're trying to get you to treat them like they're your regular parents, and it's just not. Kids don't like that stuff. Kids need stability, and this is one thing that was not there in Marvin Gaye Jr.'s childhood. And so, Mr. Marvin Gay Sr. was like a preacher, and he would travel around and go to different churches, and he was known as a healer, actually. So, I don't know how you guys out there feel about healing and miracle workers and this kind of stuff, but it sounds to me like one of these things that he was kind of sort of taking advantage of the system. And I don't know for sure if maybe it's real, maybe he did have powers and he lost them at some point. Let me know if you guys have ever encountered a healer that wasn't just a crackpot. Let me know in the comments. But so this, just to give you an idea of the type of character of this guy, who honestly believed that he had supernatural powers to heal people, heal broken bones and broken marriages, when he himself was no saint, of course. As we already talked about, there was lots of physical abuse. When I was reading about his mother, his mother generally felt that Marvin Gaye Sr. just didn't love Marvin Jr. He just didn't really care for him, and I don't know why that was. He said he wanted a male child, or he said he always wanted a son, but I guess Marvin Jr. just didn't meet his incredibly high standards. Even though, again, the guy, how can you have such high standards for everybody else when you're cheating on your wives and hitting your kids, etc. So that is Marvin Gaye Sr. Now, there's some positives here. There was a period in their life where Marvin Sr. taught Marvin Jr. how to play the piano, and he would actually sit there with him and show him chords and teach him how to play, and I guess scales and techniques and this kind of stuff. But he wanted Marvin to only play hymns. So I would guesstimate that as Marvin Gaye Jr. went deeper into his career and got more successful, that because he was not strictly in the church, because he was doing predominantly secular music, and you can listen to his music, there's a lot of suggestive and adult themes and stuff. I can imagine that Marvin Sr. was kind of maybe a little embarrassed of his son, even though he was super successful and widely considered one of the greatest R&B soul singers of all time. So there's some positives here. But what's the result of this kind of abuse? What happened to poor little Marvin? He was very depressed. He claimed that he was suicidal as a child, which is shocking, terrible, horrifying. He eventually added the E to the end of his name simply to dissociate himself from his father, from his family name. And as some of you may know, later in his life, there was a physical fight between him and his father. He wasn't letting Marvin speak to his wife, and they got into an altercation. There were some boom boom sticks, some firearms involved. I got to be careful with my language here now. There were some Second Amendment uses, some brandishing of some dangerous items, and Marvin Sr. ended up. I want to be careful with my language, but he basically ended up blasting his son and hitting vital organs. Later on, he claimed that he never meant to actually kill poor Marvin Gaye Jr., but unfortunately, that's what happened. And I guess they were both intoxicated. They were both, there's more nuance to the story there, but I'm not going to get too much into it because it's a very sad, depressing story, and we want to celebrate the good parts here. So, again, the good part is he did teach his son a lot of what he knew about music. So there's still a positive influence, even in the midst of all of this negativity, all of this disowning, all of this hatred and sadness. And it goes to show you that a lot of these stories are not so completely black or white. There's some gray areas in here. And so I thought that was a really interesting story. Now, so we've talked about good fathers. We've talked about the worst of the fathers. And of course, in my typical fashion, I've revolved the entire story around music and the music industry in general. I don't know how I keep coming up with show topics every single week about music, but here we are. So the last thing I want to do here is just speak a little bit about the importance of fathers in society at large, and I want to give you some current relevant statistics here. And this might be probably the most important part of the show, so I hope you all have stuck with me this long. And thank you if you have, seriously, because I go a little late, but I think it's worth it because I'm passionate about what I do. 18 million children are living in the United States with no father. That's a lot of kids. And you might say, oh, well, they avoided what Joe Jackson had to put Michael through. Oh, they avoided what happened to Marvin Gaye. But we're going to paint a little more of a clear picture for you. Check this out. 90% of homeless and runaway youth come from fatherless homes. All right, let that sink in a little bit. 90%, that's almost all of them. 85% of children with behavioral disorders, fatherless homes. Almost all of them. 71% of high school dropouts, no father in the house. 75% of teens who are in substance abuse centers, no father in the house. Children that grow up with no father figure to influence them, to show them the way, to give them that discipline. Children with no father in the home are twice as likely to end up in jail. And so this explains, I think, to a large degree, a lot of the things that are facing our cities, our communities, our states, and our country at large. And if you're interested, message me or whatever. I don't really have all the same tools and tricks that I would on Facebook to be able to put all the links and stuff. But when it goes up on YouTube, I will have all the links in the description. I'm not making these numbers up, okay? Only there are lies, darn lies, and statistics. All right. But if you Google the effects of fatherlessness or the effects of even single-parent households, the effects of children growing up without a father, any of those search terms will yield even more stuff. This is barely scratching the surface. But I think kids ending up in jail as juvenile delinquents, dropping out of school, substance abuse, drug addiction, being homeless, running away from home, okay? This is pretty big stuff. These are big deals here, in my opinion. And so I think that when people say, oh, fathers are just, they're like Homer Simpson, they're just, bums, they're just silly, they're just bumbling idiots. This is what they are not taking into consideration. They're not realizing that by talking badly about fathers and minimizing the contributions that fathers have on their children, they are actually perpetuating the same kind of cycle to continue to get worse and worse and worse. As I said before, I'm not a men's rights activist or advocate, however you want to call it, but I do agree with a lot of the things that these guys say. And men have higher suicide rates. They have higher, more dangerous jobs. They end up injured more, and gotta watch my language. But they end up going to heaven more when they encounter police, And a lot of these things come down to fatherlessness. And I'm not saying that's the sole reason, but I think after you look at some of these statistics that you will agree that a lot of these things might be mitigated by, maybe more folks speaking out on the positive contributions of fathers and men in our society. It's not something that gets talked about nearly enough. And again, it's not that I'm discounting women. We can do that on Mother's Day. That's cool. But since it's Father's Day today, and a lot of people just don't take it seriously, they don't celebrate it, they don't really care. They spend $5 on a card and that's it. I think it would be really cool, and it would be a really good move, and it would go a long way to repairing our society and unifying this country right now when we need it the most. I think it would go a long way if some of you guys out there really talk to your fathers, talk to the other fathers you know, tell them what they're doing right, tell them what they could be doing better, and have this conversation with them, right? And say, oh, this weird musician guy was talking about fathers, and it really got me thinking, and we really appreciate what you've done for this family, and mean it when you say it.